Hello everyone, and welcome to Movie Rundown. This is about the 2020 drama film, One Night in Miami. Please note that there are spoilers ahead. The screen is black as a sports announcer with an English accent gives a play-by-play that is unfolding somewhere behind the dark screen. Blurry lights come into view while the screen begins to focus, revealing a boxing ring at Wembley Stadium, London, in 1963. Two men throwing punches and a referee circling around them. As a crowd cheers, a bell rings and the two boxers retreat to their respective corners, with Cassius Clay raising his gloved fists as the crowd continues to jeer. Standing in his corner against the ropes, Cassius Clay's team steps into the ring. Angelo Dundee questions Cassius, and the two men debate their opposite views of how the fight is progressing. The team looks over at a beaten and bleeding Henry the Hammer Cooper before they joke with one another. Angie tries to give Clay some tips, while his team continues to cool him down and joke with him. The announcers give their opinions, while photographers snap pictures, and Cooper's team doctors him up. The bell rings, and the two fighters continue their match. The two jab and duck, swing and dance about, while trainers yell out from the sides of the ring. Cassius looks out over the crowd, distracted. Cooper throws a connecting punch. Cassius, in slow motion, falls against the ropes. Wide-eyed and dazed, he slips down to the canvas, while blurry fingers count in front of his face, and a voiceover begins. Myron Cohen stands on stage at the Copa, speaking into a microphone, while a man softly plays piano beneath his spoken story. Seated patrons look on. He throws out his punchline, and the crowd laughs. Jules Padel stands backstage with Sam Cooke, Just Rand, and his band members, all involved in a verbal dispute. The crowd claps, and an MC introduces Sam. The orchestra plays, and Sam walks out, his face showing no evidence of the dispute that moments ago occurred. He begins to speak to the crowd, and several people get up from their tables and leave. The band starts to play, and Sam begins to sing. Cigarette girls walk among the tables. Sam knocks over his mic stand as a horn player plays over his vocals. Individual patrons look disenchanted and whisper to one another. Back in his dressing room, Sam Cooke sits with his hands over his face. Jess walks in, shaking his head. His words send Sam into a rage, and he slams into Jess's chest, pushing him out of the dressing room. His two band members laugh, and Sam sits back down, snickers, and pours himself a drink. The screen blurs. An automobile with Georgia plates sails down the road with the sun bright above. Fingers tap on a steering wheel. The car pulls into a long driveway, and Jim Brown exits and grabs his jacket before ringing the doorbell at the home of Mr. Carlton. Mr. Carlton's granddaughter, Emily, greets Jim on the screened porch with joyous awe. She yells down a hallway before shaking Jim's hand with excited energy. Mr. Carlton emerges, happy to see Jim. The two men sit down together on the porch. Framed by the inside of the house window, the men have a friendly discussion. Jim's body begins to relax in his wicker porch chair while they continue to talk. Emily emerges with 2 glasses of lemonade. She serves the two men and turns to leave, but stops and reminds her grandfather of a task inside. Mr. Carlton stands. Jim rises and offers assistance. His facial features dramatically change when Mr. Carlton halts him at the door, patting Jim's shoulder in a there manner. Jim remains standing on the porch, framed by the inside house door, looking taken aback at the older man's words. A black and white television screen appears as a news broadcaster reads his script. A flash of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X appears on the screen. Betty X sits quietly in her living room, watching the screen, while the scene of her husband speaking into a microphone plays out over the small television. The front door opens and Malcolm walks in, kissing his wife before depositing his hat and coat. They engage in easy conversation until Betty becomes upset with her husband's answers. He remains calm, sitting in a chair while she paces, unfolding her arms and allowing her demeanor to soften from anger to concern. Betty moves to sit in front of her husband on the ottoman. Their discussion continues in softer tones, but no less intense. Malcolm takes Betty's hand in his and begins to explain his plan before the screen hard cuts. Jumping forward to Miami, February 25th, 1964. Cassius Clay is submerged in a swimming pool. A photographer jumps into the pool and sinks, while Clay throws punches beneath the water. His training team watches from up above, making comments. Clay and the photographer emerge in unison above the surface water of the pool. Angelo sets into giving Clay pointers on fighting Sonny Liston before Clay has pulled himself out and dried off. Angelo and Clay argue while Clay wraps himself in a robe and turns to leave, going to check on Malcolm. Angelo becomes sarcastic, and Clay does an about-face and confronts him. Angie lays down his concern with Malcolm X being in Miami. Clay questions his reasoning, and Angie proceeds to explain about investors and appearances, while the other training members look on. Clay stands his ground, and not being swayed by Angelo's concerns, he says his final words and walks away, glancing back briefly at a young woman who passes him before entering the hotel. Angelo walks back to the others who are drinking and lounging by the pool. A soft duet of voices sings in the background before the scene cuts to a hotel room, where Sam Cooke sits at the end of the bed, playing guitar and singing. Barbara sits at the hotel room vanity, rubbing lotion into her hands. The couple jokes about Sam's brother, and Barbara states her opinion in regards to the hotel, as she gazes at her reflection in the large vanity mirror. Sam watches her as she gets up and stands, leaning against the decorative wall divider. They have a sentimental moment before the phone rings. Barbara appears annoyed while Sam speaks to Malcolm over the phone. She takes up her sun hat and bag and prepares to leave the hotel room. While the two men speak, Cassius makes his way across a parking lot of the Hampton House Motel and Villas. Malcolm sits in another hotel room, much less glamorous than Barbara and Sam's. Barbara sits back down at the vanity, flustered, while Sam continues his phone conversation with Malcolm. Meanwhile, Cassius climbs the outside stairs to the second floor of the motel. There is a knock on Malcolm's motel door, and Kareem X informs Malcolm of a visitor. He rises off the bed and greets Cassius with a warm embrace. Cassius removes his shoes, while Malcolm discards his glasses and handkerchief. The two friends stand together, bow their heads, and close their eyes. They pray together, kneeling on prayer rugs while the world outside the motel room moves on. Time passes until Malcolm stands and folds his prayer rug. Cassius gives a heavy sigh before standing and looking at his reflection in the room's mirror. Malcolm gives him some advice, and Cassius shadow boxes his reflection. The two continue their easygoing conversation in regards to the upcoming fight. Malcolm shows concern, while Cassius seems confident. He sits to put his shoes back on and promptly leaves the motel. Clay and Liston box in a ring while a crowd cheers. Announcers report, the trainers yell, and Malcolm X takes pictures from his seat in the crowd. Each man throws a succession of blows. Clay taunts Liston, while Geraldine Liston yells encouragement. The bell rings and the two fighters separate to their corners, gaining tips, cooling off, and spitting water. The crowd continues to yell, and more photos are snapped. The bell rings and Clay gets up, dancing around the ring. Liston and his team watch, not leaving their corner. Sonny spits out his mouth guard, and the referee gives the signal. The crowd goes wild. Clay and his team celebrate in the center of the ring with an overhead camera view. Sam Cooke and Barbara are shown kissing one another in the crowd in celebration of the win. Jim Brown stands up from the ringside commentator's table, where he has been reporting the fight, and he fist bumps Clay over the ropes. As the celebration continues, we see Malcolm giving thanks, and Sam Cooke making his way up to the ring to stand beside Clay. Cassius yells out over the crowd to Malcolm, who takes more pictures, while Cassius points in victory at naysayers in the front row. A red sports car races up to the parking lot of the Hampton House Motel. Sam Cooke exits with guitar in hand. Kareem X greets him and lets him know he's expected. Sam is let into Malcolm's room. He is instantly taken aback, looking around the empty room with fixtures less luxurious than his room. He picks at one of the bed comforters when an airplane sounds overhead. Sam snaps his fingers a few times with an idea brewing in his head. He takes his guitar from the case and sits on the foot of the bed, strumming out the same song he played earlier for Barbara. He stops momentarily to smile with satisfaction before singing once again. Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Cassius Clay all arrive at the motel in the same vehicle. They are still celebrating and exuberant from the win. The three men enter the room where Sam is still strumming his guitar. They move around getting settled in, discussing the night and other fighters. Jim and Cassius dance around the room, boxing one another in playful spirits. Cassius jumps up on the bed, bouncing as he gives his play-by-play. He hops onto the next bed while the others laugh at his antics. He jumps back to the first bed and off to the floor, dancing around in victory, celebrating with Malcolm until he sees his reflection in the mirror. He stops short, becoming serious, and then cracks a joke. The men groan. 3 of the men want to get the party started. When Malcolm sits down and the room becomes serious, Jim and Sam state their case for going out, while Cassius goes into the bathroom. Sam and Malcolm get into a small debate over who booked his room at the swankier hotel. Jim flops down into a chair, dejected. Sam wonders if they will at least get some food. Malcolm gets up and crosses to the mini refrigerator and extracts a half-gallon of ice cream. Sam attempts to sway them all to go out. Malcolm X has other plans. When he announces to them why he thinks they should celebrate in the room, Cassius tries to stop him. After a brief moment, Cassius relents and tells Jim and Sam himself, buttoning his suit jacket with an air of pride. Sam questions him, and Malcolm jumps to his defense. This incites another debate. The room calms some as Jim cracks a few jokes. Cassius stands silent, leaning on a decorative wall divider. While talking, Malcolm gets up and searches the room, suddenly nervous. He exits the room and, accompanied by Kareem, walks back to the parking lot, as Sam ducks his head out the door and mocks him down the corridor. Back in the motel room, Jim stretches out on one of the beds, while Clay bounces like a child on the other. Sam makes a case for going out, calling out Malcolm's reasoning while he's out of the room. Jim sighs. Clay dishes out ice cream. The 3 men eat ice cream and drink from Sam's flask, hidden in his guitar case, while Malcolm makes a phone call outside to his home. His daughter, Atala, answers, and together they play a little instruction game, leading her to a book and a note. Betty is asleep on the couch, but wakes at the sound of her daughter on the phone. She tries to send her to bed, but Atala begs to stay on the phone. There's a knock on the motel door, and Clay hides the flask. Jamal pokes his head in, asking if they need anything. He extends a pad of paper and a pen toward Clay before he is waved in, and Clay signs an autograph for him. Jim signs one too. When Sam comes out of the bathroom, Jamal abruptly swipes up the pad and pen and gets Sam's autograph as well. Clay inquires if Jamal likes being a Muslim, while Sam eats ice cream straight from the carton. He gives his pros and cons, and the discussion continues. Sam lights a cigarette and goes outside. Before Jamal leaves, Clay stands and shakes his hand. The 2 remaining men pull out the flask and take another drink. Betty and Malcolm are talking on the phone. They laugh together, and then Betty cries. Their conversation becomes serious. Back in the room, Clay attends to his hair, and Jim informs him on a movie project he did. As he speaks, Clay starts to laugh, and Jim appears offended. Meanwhile, Kareem has a close eye on Malcolm out in the parking lot, while he continues his conversation with Betty. 2 men stand at a distance, observing Malcolm. Finishing his cigarette, Sam meets Malcolm in the lot. He double-checks over his shoulder before leading Sam back up to the room. Once reunited with the others in the motel, Malcolm looks out the window with unease. He checks the lamps and the phone as Clay prepares to leave the room. The 4 friends go up to the rooftop. Malcolm gives a heavy sigh, and his body relaxes. In the distance, fireworks light up the sky. Malcolm expresses his concern for his future. And to change the subject, Cassius says too much about Jim's revelation. Sam is exuberant about Jim's future plans. He and Clay do a hand slap of agreement. The mood lightens, and Malcolm shows them his camera. The 3 other men play keep away with it, while Malcolm attempts to bring it back into his possession. It nearly falls as the men laugh, Malcolm is not impressed. The joking three pose for a photo on top of the roof. Malcolm clicks the shutter button, while Cassius, Jim, and Malcolm daydream about travel plans. Sam lets them know what direction he plans for his future. Malcolm offers a challenge to Sam's intentions, and the two men debate once more, each adamant in their own opinions. The conversation gets heated, and Malcolm makes a lunge for Sam. Kareem comes out from behind the rooftop door. Sam charges him, and Kareem pushes him away before Jim steps between them. Things settle. Jim brushes off the shoulders of Kareem's jacket and shoos him away. Kareem goes to say something, and Jim steps forward, pointing a finger in his face. Kareem puts up his hands in retreat and walks away. The four return to the motel room, and the debate with Malcolm begins to boil. He calls each of them out for their actions. Malcolm flips on one of Sam's songs to add to his point, and Cassius dances around the room. Voices raise, and Jim tries to calm Malcolm down. Jim grabs the flask and takes a drink, while Malcolm's voice can be heard outside the room in the corridor. Jim whistles at the harshness of Malcolm's words towards Sam. He strolls into the bathroom and closes the door, looking at his reflection in the dim lights, while Malcolm's voice travels from the other room. Clay tries to lighten the mood without success and separates himself from them, crossing to the opposite side. Jim Brown listens through the bathroom door until Sam halts Malcolm's speech. He takes up a chair and sits at the midway point of the room. Clay interjects, and the three others look back at him, now silent. Sam crosses to the mini refrigerator and gets a drink, while Malcolm looks dejected by Clay's response to his question. Sam questions Malcolm's views and states his own in a now calmer room. When Sam finishes, Malcolm sarcastically claps. Sam grows more intense with his challenge to Malcolm's point of view, while Clay and Jim remain across the room, calm and observing. Malcolm sits on the bed, tense in his posture, as Sam lights a cigarette. Malcolm gets an idea and goes to the closet, extracting a record album. He plays it for Sam, dancing and snapping his fingers. He applies the lyrics to his cause. Sam takes a drag from his cigarette and seems indifferent. When Malcolm challenges Sam, Sam snags his coat and heads for the door, while the other two protest. Sam slams the door and Malcolm waves him off, not caring that he left. Cassius admonishes Malcolm for his harsh words. Malcolm becomes overly animated in his unapologetic reasoning and paces between Cassius and Jim. Malcolm sits, worn out from his own heightened emotions. Clay leaves to find Sam. It is at this time Jim sits with Malcolm, silent for a moment, before he explains his view of the situation. He issues Malcolm a challenging question. Malcolm gives an uneasy laugh, adjusting his glasses. Jim continues to talk to him in a softer yet more intense manner, trying to make Malcolm see more than his own point. Sitting there calmly talking, Malcolm becomes visibly emotional in his beliefs. A concerned Jim tries to soothe him and waits to listen to what Malcolm is not saying. Two young boys admire Sam's car outside a liquor store as Clay and Sam emerge. The boys congratulate Clay on his win, while Sam opens the bagged bottle of liquor. He starts to joke about Malcolm, and Cassius defends him. Sam sings as the two get into the car and engage in a serious discussion about Cassius's choice and what those choices mean to him. Sam listens and then laughs, wanting to go party. They drive off, back to the motel, coming back to join Jim and Malcolm, who sit solemnly on the beds. Sam sings, and he and Cassius dance, ready to get out of the motel and go back to Sam's hotel. Malcolm is disappointed in Clay's actions. Sam picks up his guitar. He starts toward the door, and Malcolm halts him with a question. Sam stops and leans on his case, listening. Clay moves over to sit beside Malcolm as he recounts a story. Jackie Wilson stands on a stage, earnestly singing. Sam is backstage watching, and Malcolm is in the audience. A gaggle of girls scream in the front row, reaching for Jackie. He walks off stage, and Sam's musicians walk on, while the MC announces him. The crowd goes wild. Sam starts to sing and then looks back when his audio cuts out. The crowd gets rowdy. Jackie stands staring out at Sam, quite smug. People throw things on stage and the band abandons Sam, walking off stage. Sam throws his hands up, but remains on stage. Back in the motel, Malcolm continues the story. Sam leans down to some girls in the audience and whispers to them. The crowd gets louder. Sam stumps his foot in a steady rhythm. The roar of the crowd begins to fade, and feet join in the rhythm of the stump. Sam starts to sing. The crowd quiets, and Malcolm and his team stop from leaving to return and witness what is taking place in the auditorium. Malcolm smiles at the power and ability, the way Sam has changed the mood of the audience. In the motel room, the four men sit on the two beds, calm and listening, bonding over the point of this story. Malcolm makes a confession. The four men sit in silence. Clay springs from the edge of the bed and lunges for Malcolm. The other two hold him back. He lunges a second time. All four standing now, tense. Malcolm explains his reasoning. He is emotional, and they wait to see what Cassius will do. There is a knock on the room door, and Jamal calls in to them. Clay heads toward the door, preparing to go outside and speak with waiting reporters. He stops, sighs, and asks Malcolm if he is coming. Malcolm waves him off, declining. Clay waits for him. Malcolm nods. The door opens and camera flashes go off, while Sam and Jim remain in the room. Clay yells out to the gathered crowd. Inside, Sam and Jim have a heart-to-heart. Outside, Cassius is speaking to the reporters. Cameras flash. Clay makes an announcement, while Jim and Sam, with drinks in hand, watch from the balcony. Reporters raise their hands, and Clay continues to answer. Sam and Jim clink their glasses in a deciding toast. In a restaurant full of people, Sam and Jim share a drink. Clay gets up above the crowd and informs them of what he plans to do in future fights. Crowd claps and cheers him on. Malcolm stands behind a lunch counter and snaps pictures. He stops to look out a window and sees two men in the parking lot, talking to a third, who hands them a piece of paper. He appears concerned, while the party continues around him. Sam Cooke sings in front of a television camera on the Johnny Carson show. When he is finished, he sits between Johnny and Egg McMahon. Johnny conducts the television interview. Sam explains his songwriting process, and Johnny invites him to sing another song. People clap. He agrees. Sam gets up and moves to the other camera. He sings an amazing song. Cassius Clay stands at the pulpit of a church with Elijah Muhammad. A congregation claps, and the two men shake hands. Elijah sits, and Clay remains, clapping with the crowd. A glass bottle breaks a front window of a house, and a car speeds away. Betty and Malcolm race out with their children in their arms. Betty holds the children on the sidewalk, while Malcolm aims a rifle and looks up and down their street. Their house blazes with flames. Jim Brown sits in front of a crowd of reporters. He excuses himself to get back to work. Betty X cries at the end of a motel bed where her children sleep, and Malcolm sits in a straight back chair at the room desk. He takes off his glasses and lays them on a stack of typewritten papers. Sam emotionally sings in front of the television cameras. He wipes away a tear as Malcolm watches on the black and white TV from the motel room. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this.